Hey friends, I just finished eating supper and looked down and saw Mr. Popper's Penguins and realized that I had not read to you today. I am so sorry. Today has just been one of those crazy days. It has been one thing after another, after another, after another, all day long. And it just completely slipped my mind. So I'm sorry that it is so late coming to you, but here is chapter 20 of Mr. Popper's Penguins, the last chapter. So this chapter is called Farewell, Mr. Popper. Remember, yesterday Mr. Popper had a decision to make. He had to decide if he was going to send his birds to the North Pole or if he was going to start making movies with them. All right, so let's see what he decided. It was a very long and hard decision to make. Long after the visitors had gone, Mr. and Mrs. Popper sat and discussed what would be best for everybody. Mrs. Popper could see the advantages of both offers, as she pointed these out without trying to influence him. I really feel that the penguins are really your responsibility, she said, and you have to make up your own mind. It was a very pale and haggard Mr. Popper who was ready to announce his decision the next day. Mr. Klein, he said, I want you to know how much I appreciate your offer of putting my birds in the movies. Izzy, hush. But I'm afraid I have to refuse. I do not believe that life in Hollywood would be good for the penguins. Then he turned to Admiral Drake. Admiral Drake, I am going to give you the birds. In doing this, I am considering the birds first of all. I know they've been comfortable and happy with me. Lately, though, with the excitement and all the warm weather, I've been very worried about them. The birds have done so much for me that I really have to do what is best for them. After all, they do belong in a cold climate. And then I can't help but feel sorry for all those men up at the North Pole without any penguins to help them pass the time. Your government will thank you, Mr. Popper, announced the Admiral. Congratulations, Admiral, said Mr. Klein. Maybe you're right at that, Popper. Hollywood might have been just too much for the birds. I wish you would let me make one short movie of them, though, here in New York. Before they go, just some pictures of the sort of thing that they do on stage, you know? We'd show the film everywhere with an announcement that these are the famous Popper penguins that are being taken to the North Pole by Admiral Drake of the United States Arctic Penguin Founding Expedition, or something like that. Oh, well, I would like that very much, said Mr. Popper. We would pay you, of course, continued Mr. Klein. Not a fortune, as I would have if you'd let me have a contract, but let's just say $25,000. We could use that, said Mrs. Popper. It's going to be very quiet at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, said Mr. Popper when everyone had left. Mrs. Popper did not answer. She knew that nothing she could say would really comfort him. However, said Mr. Popper, now that spring is here, I guess a lot of people will be wanting their houses to be painted, so we better be getting back. Anyway, said Bill, we've had 10 whole weeks of vacation right here in the middle of the year. Not many children in Stillwater can say that. All right, and so look at this picture. There's Mr. Popper. Oh, he looks terrible, like he had a terrible decision to make, and Admiral Drake in the middle, and then I guess that's the movie man, not Mr. Greenbaum, on the other side. I can't remember his name all of a sudden. Mr. Klein, that's his name, sorry. The next day, the cameramen arrived to make the picture of the penguins doing their tricks. It was arranged that the Poppers should stay in New York just long enough to see the expedition off. Meanwhile, in the harbor, the great sailing ship of Admiral Drake was being made ready for its long trip north. Every day, huge boxes of supplies of all sorts were being hustled on board. The most comfortable quarters on the ship were turned over to the penguins, who were the cause of the voyage. Captain Cook was already quite familiar with the ship, since it was the same one that Admiral Drake had sailed on to the South Pole, where Captain Cook had often seen it. Greta, too, had seen vessels of its kind. The two of them were kept very busy showing and explaining everything to Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. The sailors all took great delight in watching the curious little birds on their explorations. "Oh, it looks like this is going to be a lively trip," they would say. "These Popper penguins certainly live up to their reputation." When at last everything was ready, and the day came when the Poppers were to go down and say goodbye, Bill and Janie ran all over the ship. They didn't want to leave when it came time to draw up the gangplank. The Admiral shook hands with them and with Mrs. Popper and thanked them for having to help train the extraordinary penguins that were to be a real contribution to science. Mr. Popper had gone down below to say a private farewell to his birds. All that kept him from breaking down completely was the knowledge that what he was doing was best for them too. First, he said goodbye to all of the younger penguins, and then to Greta, who had saved Captain Cook. Last of all, he leaned over to say a special goodbye to Captain Cook, who had come and made life so different from Mr. Popper. Then he wiped his eyes, he straightened his back, and we went up on the deck to say goodbye to Admiral Drake. Poor Mr. Popper. Look at this picture of him. He looks so sad. I think he loves his pets very much. It's always sad have to say goodbye to anything, right? "Goodbye, Admiral Drake," he said. "Goodbye," repeated the Admiral. "Why, what do you mean? Aren't you coming with us?" "Me? Go with you to the North Pole?" "Why, of course, Mr. Popper." "But how can I go with you? I'm not an explorer or a scientist. I'm just a house painter." "But you're the keeper of the penguins, aren't you?" roared the Admiral. "Man alive, aren't those penguins the whole reason for the expedition? Who's going to see that they're well and happy if you don't go along? Why don't you go put on one of those fur suits like the rest of us? We're going to be pulling anchor in a minute." "Mama!" shouted Mr. Popper to Mrs. Popper, who had already gone up the gangplank. "I'm going too! I'm going too! Admiral Drake says he needs me, Mama. You don't mind if I won't come home for a year or two, do you?" "Oh, well, as to that," said Mrs. Popper, "I will miss you very much, my dear, but we have money to live on for a few years now, and in the winter it will be much easier to keep the house tidy without a man sitting around all day. I'll just be getting back to Stillwater. Tomorrow is the day for the meeting of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society, and I'll be there just in time, so goodbye, my love, and good luck." "Goodbye, good luck," echoed the children, and the penguins, hearing their voices, all scuttled up on deck and stood there beside the Admiral and beside Mr. Popper. And they solemnly lifted their flippers and waved as the great ship moved slowly down the river towards the sea. Oh, how excited Mr. Popper must be. He has always wanted to go on one of those Arctic expeditions, and now he gets to go. I don't know, I think that would be kind of sad, though, for Janie and Bill does not get to see their dad for 2 whole years while he is in the Arctic. But I know Mr. Popper will be excited to get to go and to still see his penguins. I hope you liked Mr. Popper's Penguins. That was the last chapter. And next week we will be starting a new book. We'll have to wait and see which one we decide. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you soon.